Welcome to the TRT World Forum Digital Debate Series titled Designing the Future of Planet Earth Towards the Green Transition, which includes a series of discussions on the trending issues of climate change and energy transition. My name is Samet Shahin. I'm a researcher at TRT World Forum, and today we will have the third session of our debate series with the title of Rethinking the Role of Natural Gas in the Green Transition with my distinguished guests. In the last decade, the market's share of natural gas has increased more than any other energy source. Many would agree that natural gas consumption is not likely to endure in the long term due to rising political, economic, and social awareness about decarbonization efforts. On the other hand, Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, has argued that natural gas is one of the mainstays of global energy, as it replaces more polluting fuels, improves air quality, and, and limits carbon dioxide emissions. Furthermore, several major phenomena, such as rising energy demand in Asia, the shale gas revolution in the US, extreme weather conditions such as cold spells and droughts, and the increasing popularity of the LNG trade are also noteworthy developments. With that being said, how will discussions around natural gas evolve in the future? What kind of shifts should we expect in the international gas outlook and the engagement among market actors at different levels of energy supply, transit, and demand? To discuss these questions and more, joining me today, we have Peter Fraser, the head of gas, coal, and power markets division at the International Energy Agency. Having 30 years of experience in energy policy, this is his second sojourn at the IEA, having been a senior electricity policy advisor earlier on. In between his IEA assignments, Mr. Fraser worked at the Ontario Energy Board, the energy regulator in the Canadian province of Ontario, most recently as Vice President of Consumer Protection and Industry Performance. Also, for 9 years period, he was an energy policy advisor at the Ontario Ministry of Energy. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Fraser. And we host Mike Fullwood, a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, who has 40 years of experience in the gas industry. Before joining the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, Mr. Fullwood worked as a consultant at Energy Markets and as the director of global gas and LNG at Nexant ECA. Earlier on, he was director at British Gas Transco in charge of price control review, and prior to that, president of British Gas Americas, during which he oversaw many acquisitions and projects. Moreover, he was also the chairperson of the International Gas Union's gas pricing group and still undertakes the union's wholesale gas price survey. On behalf of Charity World Forum, I'd like to thank you for joining us, Mr. Fullwood. Thank you both for being here this evening. Indeed, being an aspiring energy expert, I'm really excited to host such speakers with immense knowledge and experience in the field. I want to open up the discussion with you, Mr. Fraser. There's an ongoing debate on natural gas. On the one hand, it is often acknowledged as a promising resource for cleaner atmosphere and decarbonization, which are the reasons why many analyses see a continued need for gas to 2040 and beyond. On the other hand, others think that the world shouldn't rely on natural gas because it's a temporary and expensive solution that would have negative effects on further decarbonization. as it's still a carbon emitting energy source. What is your take on natural gas?
Well, Samad, it's a very complicated question, as you can anticipate. It's something we tried to tackle earlier this year when we published our Net Zero in 2050 analysis. And in that scenario, we looked at what it would take to get the world on the track for a 1.5 degree rise in global temperature. We're already over 1 degree, as you know. And it's very challenging to get there. But what it would take is a combination of 5 things. Way more energy efficiency. We have to decarbonize the power sector completely. We have to electrify many of our end uses. And then we need for the rest, we need to either have low carbon fuels or we need to use carbon capture and storage. We do those 5 things to get emissions down to net zero by 2050 and to get them down fast enough so that we can keep with the 1.5. We see how that might be possible. Now, important thing to note is that even though the scenario doesn't see a big role for gas, particularly in the power sector, beyond 2040, gas or gases more generally have a pretty significant role even out in 2050. A lot of those gases will have to be low carbon gases, either biogases like biomethane, or they will have to be hydrogen, which we think will have a significant role. That said, we still think fossil gas, even in this very high environmental case, will still have a significant amount of supply, maybe close to half of what it is today, which is very significant when you think about it's a net zero in the net zero context. And it'll be used either with CCUS, either partly to make hydrogen, because it makes about 38% of the hydrogen in our scenario, or it will be used in petrochemicals, or it will be used in smaller amounts in the power sector with CCUS. So even in that extreme case, we see in the long term gas having some role. But in the next 10 years, gas has even a much more important role to play. And I think we're starting to recognize that that's going to happen. There's a big push right now, and it was very evident at COP26, for countries to get out of coal very quickly. When we see that, we also see that in the short run to medium run, natural gas plays a very important complementary role. Now, when you're relying on natural gas and there isn't a lot of coal, prices can get a little high, as we're seeing this year. But it means that gas as a security fuel is going to be more important, especially in the next decade or so, regardless of the way the world unfolds, than it's ever been, with all this push to get out of coal. So that's kind of how two ways to look at the future. One is a very important role for gas in any case as a short-term security, and a long-term a residual role for gas, but increasingly complemented or replaced by low-carbon gases.
Mr. Fullwood, we know that natural gas has played a key role both in addressing local air quality issues in jurisdictions that have made significant shifts away from coal towards natural gas in terms of power generation. It has also helped facilitate a relative reduction in overall carbon dioxide emissions globally. In Asia, in particular, it has played a significant role in displacing coal. Generally speaking, what role can natural gas play in facilitating the transition towards renewables? And what are the key challenges and opportunities in this regard?
Yes, thank you, Samad, and thank you, Peter, for giving a good, really overall background to this topic as well. Yes, I mean, coal to gas switching obviously does reduce CO2 emissions, and we've seen that. I mean, CO2 emissions from coal are about twice those of natural gas. And probably the best examples of that have been in the UK, where, with an additional carbon tax, coal's virtually been wiped out the market. And in the US, where because of the low price of gas relative to coal, we've seen US emissions come down as well. In fact, those two countries have probably seen the fastest reduction in emissions of any major economy, coupled with obviously increasing renewables, especially in wind in the UK. So, on the face of it, obviously, any sort of move from coal to gas is good in terms of lower CO2 emissions. And this, as you said, there's significant scope in Asia. And that's not just China and India. I mean, China and India is what you really think of because they're the two largest users of coal in power generation. But you've got a lot of countries like in the Asian countries of Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam. A lot of countries use coal, and a lot of them are looking to increase the share of gas in the mix, especially in the power generation mix. In terms of the challenges, I think you can't avoid it with 5 minutes without mentioning price, and Peter managed it in 2 minutes, so I'm going to do it again. That especially now, that's a really key factor, because whereas coal in Asia, for example, a lot of it is indigenous coal, probably relatively low cost and no carbon tax to sort of speak of, then they're a lot reliant on imported gas, which currently now is a very, very high price. I mean, even in 2019, 2020, obviously a lot lower prices. So it's a very difficult economic hill for gas to climb to displace coal in those markets without some help from sort of more sort of carbon tax, carbon policy. The other thing I would say is that, I mean, greenhouse gases is not just about methane emissions. I mean, maybe Peter will talk about this later as well, but they can also be an issue, and they obviously stay a shorter time in the atmosphere than CO2, but have a multiple impact in terms of sort of temperature. So there's quite a lot of low-hanging fruit there that we can do to reduce emissions. But it's also say, obviously, coal also emits methane at probably a similar global level to gas. So it's you've got to eliminate methane emissions for both. So I think to sort of sum up, I mean, simple displacement of coal to gas is only a partial solution. And Peter mentioned carbon capture and storage. So I think if gas is to stay relevant for a long time in the mix, then it needs to be combined with carbon capture and storage. So we virtually eliminate emissions from natural gas, both CO2 and obviously reduce methane emissions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Fulwood. Speaking of displacing gas, and you mentioned that some of the countries would need help. I want to ask a question to Mr. Fraser. It is possible to argue that fossil fuels, particularly the gas, has been associated with development and growth in the last century, and it will play an integral role in the future of economic development, most importantly for the developing countries. Yet we all know that the growth needs to be decoupled from fossils to achieve net zero. How will it work for the developing countries? Will it be possible to decouple growth from natural gas in the near future? And how will be the environmental impacts of natural gas consumption can be addressed?
Well, it's a complex question, but it's certainly true historically that many countries associated their development of their coal resources with their economic development. And most recently, China's been probably the most prominent example, has greatly increased their production and consumption of coal. But we have new items on the menu now, particularly in the power side. We actually these countries can actually develop wind and solar resources at a price lower than building electricity price lower than they could for a new coal plant. That's something that wasn't available until very recently, an option until very recently. And so they have both China and India is a good example of areas where we might have suggested that, well, to clean up your power sector, go to gas. Now have a cheaper option and go to renewables instead. And so displace the amount of coal you need by building out renewables. Where we see gas having one role is in industry sectors, and in cases like China, household sectors too, where coal had been used quite extensively. And there you see, for air quality reasons, which is one of the other arguments for gas, as you mentioned, Dr. Birol mentioned, has argued. You see a strong policy push for gas to displace coal in households and displace coal in industries. So there's some real opportunities to work hand in hand with economic growth and reduce actually not just CO2 emissions, but more air quality, improve air quality at the same time. So you do see an opportunity there. The other is in countries where they've just started to develop their natural gas resources. You see places in Africa, for example, Nigeria is very interested in developing its gas resources. And there they see an economic opportunity, which they may now want to develop more urgently, their gas as part of their economic development. So I still think that's still a very important factor in government decision making, despite the fact they also want to balance with the other environmental needs, imperatives that they have.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. I want to continue with this issue of development and growth. Mr. Fullwood, natural gas has often been pointed to as having significant potential to reduce what is referred to as energy poverty. For example, Egypt represents a good example for this, given that the natural gas discoveries it has made in the course of last several years has made it much less reliant on energy imports and has even provided Egypt the potential to becoming a net energy exporter. Considering that it will take time to build up a renewable system throughout the world, can natural gas act pragmatic bridging fuel, particularly for energy poor countries?
Yes, I mean, you mentioned Egypt in your question, and Peter talked briefly about Africa as well. I mean, let's take Africa as an example because it's one of the best in terms of the points you're trying to make. I mean, renewables really. I want to talk about solar and wind. There's quite a bit of hydro. Solar and wind has made almost no progress at all in much of Africa, and that's one of the real problems. I mean, outside the southern part, the three southern countries, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, there's very little coal as well. So if you exclude those three, you've got very little coal. And then there are, as Peter said, some gas-rich countries like Nigeria, Algeria, and Egypt, which have their own resources. But the rest of Africa really, apart from some of the exporting gas exporters like Angola, Equatorial Guinea, then a lot of them, with some hydro, have to rely quite a lot on oil for power generation, and generally that's almost all imported oil as well. So they have to pay sort of world market prices for that. So there is scope there, I think, for gas to displace oil, but again, that sort of has to be cost effective. Other than this year, obviously with the very high prices. I mean, gas has always really been. Even imported LNG has always been a lot cheaper than oil in terms for a lot of these markets. So we're not seeing really any LNG imports at the moment into sub-Saharan Africa, but they're sort of starting up. So I think there is scope for gas to play a role in reducing energy poverty and expanding electrification in Africa especially. However, there's one of the issues at COP26, which I think is right. It's really not possible for the rich world, the North America, Europe, and Asia, which is responsible for most of the CO2 emissions and most of the burning of fossil fuels, to deny the developing world, such as Africa, the opportunity to develop. So, really, to be honest, the rich world has a responsibility to put their hands in the pockets and make sure that the development and energy poverty in Africa and other places like that is reduced and it can be properly funded.
Thank you, Mr. Fullwood. Mr. Fraser, I want to get back to you. As we mentioned, Fatih Birol, Director of International Energy Agency, he said, no energy company will be unaffected by clean energy transitions. Every part of the industry needs to consider how to respond. Doing nothing is not an option. what should be the role of energy companies in the green transition?
Well, it's pretty clear that in our estimate in our net zero scenario of up to $4 trillion a year of energy investment, that there's a big opportunity for energy companies, clean energy companies particularly, to invest. That becomes challenging in particular parts of the world, as Mike alluded to, and so governments have a role to play in making that happen, to make it possible to attract the funds. But there's certainly an enormous role for the private sector. But existing, say, oil and gas companies have more particular things that they can do today. One of the areas that they could focus on, as Mike referred to, was on the methane side. Whereas with reduction of methane emissions from the production of coal in our net zero scenario, those emissions get reduced basically by producing less coal. There's actually a lot of cost-effective mitigation options in oil and gas, where you can actually reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and the greenhouse impact, which is because, as Mike alluded to, it's much quicker, and therefore cutting the emissions it produces a measurable impact much faster. Now that can be done by the sector itself, and it's about 70 odd million tons of methane that are emitted from the oil and gas sector. And the global methane pledge, which was announced at COP26, is a big step in that direction, both for governments and for companies to stand up and say, we're going to cut the methane emissions from our operations. And our analysis suggests that you could cut those emissions around 75% in a rather relatively cost-effective way. So that's really quite a positive thing that they could be doing, and they'll do it. Voluntarily. It's great, and they may need regulations to support that. And so we've done a study as well to identify what rules need to change or to encourage that kind of methane reduction in oil and gas operations.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Mr. Fullwood, I want to turn back to you again. Given we mentioned COP26, and we were talking about the governments coming together and putting their aims and goals towards net zero to 2050. Given the highly charged debate around the ethics of climate responsibility, as well as the strategic value placed by governments on ensuring adequate access to secure energy sources, how does the geopolitics of natural gas factor into both the discussion and policies regarding the energy transition?
Yeah, thank you, Sumit, for that easy question. Yeah, it's glad you raised COP26. I mean, you've got different countries, different regions, very, very split on how this is achieved, and you've got them moving on different timescales. India said it'd be net zero by 2070, China by 2060, a lot of Europe by 2050. So everybody's moving at a different pace, which is causes a lot of problems. So there's very different approaches to this. I mean, in Europe, for example, that's one of the continents been at the forefront of the push to move rapidly away from fossil fuels, including gas. Although I think in recent months we've noted a little bit of rowing back on Europe in terms of gas could still be important, especially when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. So there's a little bit rowing back on that. So I think there's a maybe an increasing role for gas in the European policy mix. And then I think one of the key points of COP26 was when the word unabated was inserted in the text at the last minute. And actually, I think that is correct, because if you could, certainly in terms of if you're focused on reducing emissions, then if you can abate gas especially, or even coal, then it all helps in terms of the carbon budget we have. We've got longer time to try and roll out renewables on a more rapid basis. So anything you can abate will certainly help. I mean, obviously, there's you got a lot of producer countries in the Middle East, Russia, obviously very keen to export more, although we'll come on to Russia later. And Qatar, I think, is embarking on a sort of a we'll sell it all before it goes out of fashion type of strategy. So they're pushing to sell it, and actually they're looking to do it, to be fair, in a very low carbon way. I think that's the approach they're sort of doing. I mean, I think, as noted earlier, a lot of countries in Asia and Africa are still keen to develop gas. So we've got a little bit of parallel worlds where some are pushing in one direction, so some in another. And I think gas has an opportunity to navigate this narrow path. But I repeat really what Peter said and I said earlier on. But the gas industry does need to make a lot of progress in reducing methane emissions, because that can have a material impact on greenhouse gas emissions in the next 10 to 15 years. So I think if gas wants to navigate this path, then it has to make progress on methane emissions.
Thank you, Mr. Fullwood. As I understood so far, we will definitely need natural gas during the transition. Well, being delved into politics, I just want to keep up with this. Mr. Fraser, according to IEA, national oil companies which are fully or majority owned by national governments, account for well over half of global production and an even larger share of gas reserves. There are some high performing national oil companies, but many are poorly positioned to adapt to change in global energy dynamics. This is, of course, dependent on the national interests of the producing states. What shall we expect for the future of national oil companies regarding their political and economic burdens to integrate them into the transition?
Well, I think the last couple of years has reminded the governments of those countries of the volatility associated with depending on oil or gas revenues. Last year, oil prices were very low, as were gas prices, and this year they're high again. Last year imposed a certain amount of risk on those economies, and it's not a new story to suggest those economies need to diversify. As we've already mentioned, of course, national oil companies, oil and gas companies, like other energy companies, this methane issue is an important one, both on the oil and the gas side. This is a big opportunity for them. Buyers of gas and oil are going to start, we expect, going to start to be more selective and looking at the environmental footprint of the upstream, and going to be asking more questions. So I think it's going to be incumbent on them to change their to improve their environmental footprint, including cutting methane emissions. But there's also some new opportunities, especially in this new energy economy that's emerging. For example, in Saudi Arabia, they're very keen on moving into hydrogen. First of all, developing solar power, so that solar power becomes half of the power supply in Saudi Arabia by 2030. But then developing it further, along with some wind, and or developing their gas resources to make hydrogen and export it. So it could be a hydrogen or ammonia exporting country in the future. And certainly that would be compatible with something that we would see in our net zero emissions. And the technical expertise of a large oil and gas company like Saudi Aramco or others is certainly rather compatible with that new vision of becoming a major developer and player in the global hydrogen market as it develops.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. I'll continue with this political aspects in general. Mr. Fullwood, considering that gas supply is mostly dependent on national energy companies, as I asked Mr. Fraser, it is possible to argue that gas is a politicized and even a securitized resource in some cases. As an example, in your recent pieces, you mentioned Gazprom as it might be holding back volumes to ensure the market remains tight. When it comes to the political interests the gas trade entails, what would be the possible scenarios for gas producer countries in net zero transition view?
Yeah, thank you, Samad. I think I already mentioned, that Qatar seems to be adopting a strategy of kind of producing it as rapidly as they can, and I think, we'll come in a little bit to what Gazprom might be doing now. But I think the Russia strategy generally is to expand its production. If not to Europe, then it's obviously sending more gas to China by pipeline, wants to roll out more LNG export terminals. So I think it's generally one of, from their vast resource base, is to produce. And I think they may be looking at producing it in a more lower carbon manner. But you're right. I mean, gas has always been a little bit political. I mean, we've had the US trying to tell Europe not to buy so much Russian gas for many years, not just over the recent issues. And obviously, the Nord Stream 2, which is the pipeline which is going to run from Russia directly to Germany on the Baltic, that's become heavily politicized with the US levying sanctions, and the German regulator now having sort of suspended for a while the process of approving the pipeline. So that's obviously very political. But I think in some respects it only really impacts the market when the market's very tight. The political aspects don't seem to me to have much impact when there's plenty of supply hanging around. I mean, in terms of, you said, we mentioned that Gazprom might be holding back volumes. I think it has to be said, I think Gazprom and Russian production has been at record levels this year. They've had very cold weather in Russia as well in the early part of the year, so that had to supply that market. And during the summer months, they had to rebuild their own storage stock. So they were also producing a lot to do that. I would say they probably weren't holding back volumes through September and probably October. But since early November, the flows along the Belarus route have been much lower, even than in the first 3 quarters of the year. So having filled their own storage, I think now there is gas available that's not being sent. There was gas available over and above the contract nominations from the buyers. I think that's partly political, to put pressure on the approval of Nord Stream 2, but also it's now, I think, a bit more economic, because much of Gazprom's portfolio of sales is now linked to the spot price. So, sort of as much as 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, a lot of their contracts were linked to oil. So back in those days, they could put more gas on the market and not really affect their revenues. Now, of course, if they put more gas on the market and bring the price down by quite a bit, it affects all their revenues. So there's also maybe an economic rationale for them not putting so much gas on the market.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. I want to turn back to Mr. Fraser. Sorry, Mr. Fulwood.
No worries.
My question is to Mr. Fraser. Okay.
Yeah.
The gas sector has started to embrace the idea of greening natural gas in order to reconcile the vision of a decarbonized energy system with projections of continued consumption of the fuel. What are the main challenges associated with so-called greening of the natural gas?
You're muted, Peter.
Yeah, Mr. Fraser.
Sorry, there we go. Certainly, some of our in our net zero 2050 scenario, we see a very significant role for low carbon gases. But there are quite a few challenges even now today getting started down that road, and even more in the future. And the first, of course, is that injecting low carbon gases into an existing transporting them Now that's not such a big problem for biomethane. You can ensure reasonable quality of that, but it gets a little more difficult when we start injecting hydrogen. I see the proposals out today from the European Commission are proposing ways to deal with that, but that's an immediate technical issue that they're going to have to deal with. The second and equally obvious one is that although today's prices might not appear to be a problem, nobody believes that today's prices for natural gas are going to be around for that long. And when prices return back to normal levels, then the cost of biomethane or hydrogen is going to be significantly more expensive than the cost of natural gas. And so that's obviously not going to be a strong incentive on its own, even with quite significant carbon prices, to get customers to want to switch. It's going to cost them more money to heat their homes or power their businesses. So you have that economic thing as well. But if you have a net zero vision, you will want to try to put in the right kinds of incentives in place to gradually allow things to move over. There are certainly some very great plans in Europe for converting systems to hydrogen, to convert whole pipelines to carry nothing but hydrogen instead of carrying natural gas. There are obviously some technical changes that would need to be made for that to happen, but that really means driving the demand for hydrogen significantly higher than it is today. So those combination of supplying low carbon gases with existing natural gas and supplying low carbon gases separately, especially hydrogen, both create certain kinds of technical challenges to get us there, as well as economic ones.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Speaking of the relation between natural gas and the renewables, Mr. Fullwood, what is needed to realize to the full potential of gas as an effective partner for renewables?
I think, yes, obviously in terms of we talk about the intermittency, especially in the power sector of solar and wind. So I think there's, in that sense, I mean, gas is complementary. I know Peter talked about the sort of phasing out, certainly by 2050 of gas in the power sector. I think our view at Oxford is that the gas could have a bigger role to sort of play in that, especially if, I think on the IEA's net zero scenario, there's quite a lot of growth in nuclear, hydro, and sort of other renewables, which I think is sort of tidal power and geothermal. So if they don't materialize, then I think to sort of balance the power sector a little bit, you need more gas, but I think it has to be abated gas. So it just emphasises the point about what you really need to do, I think, is more carbon capture and storage. And I think there is scope around the world for significant ways of storing the carbon you capture, especially in the North Sea. But it again comes down to the economics of being able to do that. Clearly, with a sort of high carbon taxes, which a lot of countries don't seem willing to embrace, then the economics can be justified. Without the high carbon taxes, then somebody's got to pay for it, basically, and that, I think, becomes the issue, is that who's eventually going to pay for the cost of the energy transition? Is it the taxpayer or the consumer? Or I talked about the developing world. It's the taxpayers in the developed world which may need to pay for the transition in the developing world. So I think, to get back to your question, really, and in terms of the gas role, I think gas and solar and wind especially can go hand in hand, but there's an urgent need to abate that gas as we go down that route.
Thank you, Mr. Fullwood. Mr. Fraser, given that the new gas infrastructure ultimately prevents the combustion of more polluting fuels, at least in the near term, and despite the fact that it can increase absolute emissions, can an environmental case be made for building a new gas infrastructure or focusing on increasing the ability of high coal producing and consuming nations to switch to natural gas. We can't hear you.
Go again. The short answer to that is that it depends where you are. And for example, very recently, the Irish government announced that it saw a need for new natural gas infrastructure to maintain security of supply as they increase their share and even to hang on to some of their existing gas infrastructure to maintain their security of electricity supply. And they really see, they were very, very clear about that this was going to be needed in order to have a reliable electricity supply. Now, Ireland is it's connected to the UK, but it's more or less on it to some degree to France, I believe. But it's more or less on its own, and it's a more difficult situation to balance. It can't rely on its neighbors so much. But still, it's an example we've seen, even in Germany now, with the new announcement of the coalition agreement. And they say they want to get out of all coal by 2030, in addition to the fact they're already closing their nuclear plants by the end of next year. It's really not possible to see how they get to balance their power system without investing in new gas plants. But as Mike was saying, when we're thinking about what kind of gas that they use, do they use hydrogen? Germany has big ambitions on hydrogen. Or should they be at least what they call hydrogen ready to convert to hydrogen when the hydrogen is available? Because they're not being used so much for the great amounts of energy. They're being used for much of it for security purposes. A good example of that in Germany. So a month ago, the wind from one day can go from 50 gigawatts to the next day to 1, and the demand is at 66. So so even if they double or triple their wind and solar, there are going to be days where very little of their demand can actually be met by the wind and solar, and other days where they'll have surplus that they will have to do something about. So there is a real security argument for some kind of balancing of supply and demand using some kind of gas. And in the short run, as you suggested, probably going to be natural gas. But we have to think about the future. And so you build new infrastructure, it really will be the question as well, what can it be adapted to a newer, lower carbon future? Or do you need to balance off some other things? And for example, how quickly you phase out of coal and these other questions. So you have these complexities in developing countries, as I think we talked about earlier. You're trading off with cost all the time, and so on the power side, you really are going the renewables route as a cheaper path. But for other industry, there's some real opportunities, particularly where that industry is urban and there's a real air quality issue. Then gas continues to have a significant opportunity in say the non-power sectors to really increase its share. And the third would be, as I think as Mike also mentioned, in countries where they're producing gas and they have gas to use. Obviously, as the economies grow, there's some ability for the gas to grow in those countries.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Mr. Fullwood, we just mentioned that natural gas is bound to some political dynamics as it's being produced mostly by national oil companies. And it basically means that it can be politicized and securitized in the political arena as an economic commodity or as a political commodity, let's say. Currently, we talk about an energy crisis. We also mentioned that, but I want to get a bit deeper on this. This energy crisis storming particularly the European Union as well as the other importing countries who are dependent on the natural gas. natural gas supply concentrated in the hands of large suppliers. Speaking of the EU and Russia relationship, uh, what kind of a scenario shall we expect for the gas supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, talking around about sort of, I guess, Europe as the sort of introduction to that. I think I mean, obviously Russia is one of the major supplier to Europe, the wider Europe and the European Union. But there are obviously pipeline imports from North Africa, Iran into Turkey and Azerbaijan, and increasingly into southern Europe as well, and obviously quite a bit of LNG. A lot of which comes from the Middle East, but also the US, from all over the world, really. So it's not totally dependent on Russia, but it is highly dependent. I think in terms, I think looking at sort of the short term, medium term into next year, then I think there's two issues. When will Nord Stream 2 come on? And the second one is, would more volume from Russia get sent anyway along what we call the Belarus route, I guess through Belarus and Poland. So I think they're the two issues for the supply side from Russia. The Ukraine route's not going to see any additional volumes. It's running at the capacity that Gazprom booked. But also say, obviously, there's been quite a big increase in Russian volumes this year going down the Turk Stream route, and that's a pipeline which runs from Russia to the European side of Turkey, close to where you are, Sami, to Istanbul. So and we've seen increased volumes along there, diverted away from the Ukraine route to feed both Turkey and also now onward into sort of southern Europe. So Russia has increased volumes there, but it's more diverting away from Ukraine. I think obviously there's potential military issues on the Ukraine border, but let's setting those aside, shall we say, for 1 second. And I think Nord Stream 2 is not going to come on in time for this winter. So I think we can forget that. But it's quite likely to come in the middle of next year. So we would certainly see increased volumes from Russia. Then I think they would look pretty stupid if they didn't increase volumes and just diverted more away, given what they've said. So I think the winter really depends on the sort of ramping up of flows along the Belarus route. I think we could see higher nominations from buyers in January. I think some of the contracts allow for higher nominations in the first quarter. But I think ultimately it depends on Gazprom being willing. I think they're being willing to sell more gas on the spot market. So Nord Stream 2 in summer is not going to come right into the rescue this winter. And we are reliant on sort of increased volumes from Russia. If they got back to last year's levels, I think that would ease the situation. But also, we shouldn't forget certainly the LNG market. Well, there does seem to be a bit more supply on this year than last year. A number of issues in the summer months with a number of plants being subject to low feed gas or technical issues. Some of those have gone away, and there's some more US terminals sort of coming on. So I think we might see some easing in the LNG market a little bit. But I think the key really is how much gas is going to flow from Russia this winter. That'll determine where the market ends up.
Thank you, Mr. Fullwood. I have one last question to Mr. Fraser. Mr. Fraser, we are living in an era of social media where people are well aware of what is going on with the planet and with politics, and we have some environmental activists such as particularly the young people like Greta Thunberg or Louisa Neubauer. What do you think about the role of social movements in the future of decarbonization and in the green transition?
Well, I think it's clear that they're having an increasing influence, and that we're an intergovernmental organization. We can't afford to ignore that, and we have to be more open to engaging with that. I think in the last 2 or 3 years, in particular, we've made a lot of efforts to increase our own social media presence, to increase the accessibility of our work our experts to a broader public, and not just to advise directly our governments. So we're quite active on Twitter, for example, and we're also making more of our information freely available on our website. So, and maybe for more those that are curious to get into more depth, we have sort of a landing page where they can learn a few headlines. But if they're interested, there's now a lot more information that they can freely access, which before was only in a book, which you had to pay €100 to get. So I'm hopeful that by engaging people on our work, making more of our work freely available, that we in turn can have an influence on their thinking, and we can help with their support, help guide a sort of a sensible process for moving through this energy transition.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fraser. Before closing, I should recommend our audience that the works of both institutions represented here, the International Energy Agency and Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, both in social media or on official websites, you can find a lot of relevant information about the environmental change, climate change, green transition, and all type of information about energy. So this was a personal recommendation, actually, because I'm benefiting from these resources a lot in my studies and in my research, actually. So thank you, gentlemen. It was just a pretty insightful session and discussion for me, actually. Hopefully we can see you in our future events as well. So yeah, good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.